Okay, greetings, brothers and sisters. I made this video called The One True Religion, and I'm pretty sure I didn't post it here. This is Tuesday, May 6th. I released this video last week. But anyways, I'm just putting this up here. I'll double check to see if I already posted it here. And this will probably wrap up the whole thing with the Babaji birthday gathering, which is I'm still feeling the condition from it. I'm still feeling the effects, which is really good. This is now 5 days after the gathering. But anyways, here's the video called One True Religion. I posted this on my Box of the Future channel and thought it was appropriate to put on this channel. Okay, greetings, brothers and sisters. Today is Wednesday, April 30th, 2024, or 25. It's, I understand why I get the day wrong, but the year. Today is Babaji's birthday, so he's the second master, sort of the pivotal figure in the Sahaj Marg system in various ways. And my wife and I, I rewatched the movie Heretic, and she saw it for the first time, and we've been talking about it quite a bit. And there's a moment in the beginning of the movie, a little bit of spoiler alert for the movie. I really enjoyed the movie more a second time because I was prepared for the gross horror stuff, which was limited for the movie. But, like that kind of stuff is always, there's the idea that you'll see something so icky and that it leaves a, impression and just lingers, That's why I don't like those kind of movies. But it was, very necessary for the movie. Well, there's a movie where he's talking to these two, these sister, whatever they are, the Mormon sisters, who are proselytizing and trying to convert them to Mormonism. And he tells them he found the one true religion, and he doesn't reveal to the end that it's about control, that all religions are about control of the people. That's the one true religion. And, we were talking about how it's such a great movie for all systems of control, which is what we talk about here in the truth community, how people control other people. And, this is a great analogy. This one's about religion, and, a lot of it has to do with Mormonism, but it can be anything. And so it's just a great movie. It's just a masterpiece. But what I want to talk about here is what is the one true religion? And the answer is none of them are, for the reason that the control, because of there are systems of material control, right? So really, when we're talking about the one true religion, we're talking about the best way to connect to God, right? What's the best way? And I have a very unique perspective because, the difference between spirituality and religion is that in spirituality, you have an internalized connection to God because divinity is within you. Every religion that believes in a soul, and there's some, religions that are just, goofy, whatever, a small little sects of something. But any real religion believes in a soul, like there has to be a soul. Otherwise, there's no point. Like, if there's no soul, there's no God. If there's God, you have a soul. If there's divinity that exists in an abstract form, what science doesn't acknowledge is there's abstract life. And so when they look for whether there's life on planets, many of these planets have etheric beings on them, right? Like etheric beings that can, certainly are not bound to the planet, but they're not physical life. And so, etheric life can't be measured by material instrumentation, scientific instrumentation. So, there is their etheric life. There's their etheric life, and is our bodies animated by something that's a soul? And it clearly is, from my perspective. I've had numerous experiences with a soul. Like I said, when I was 10 years old, and I saw my first dead body, who was my grandfather. My grandfather was a tough guy. He had fought in 2 world wars and played professional football without helmet. Back when they had those leather freaking helmets, and like we still had the helmet. He paid for $10 a game. He was a fireman, and he broke his back. Was fighting fires. I mean, it was like an action figure. It was like he was 15 years old when he went to his first war. And he liked it so much he went back for World War II. So like when he was in, he must have been in his like 30, 40 years old. So like he was, so he was like a very, he brought me deep sea fishing and pool halls, and he was like, in some ways my favorite relative. And he did things. He built boats and built fishing poles, and he was, I mean, like he was cool. He did things. He had skills and things, and like his fishing poles were like ones you buy at a store. They weren't so like he built boats for people. Like he built some like boats for rich people in Boca Raton, Florida, where he retired, and so he had all these he had a lot of things that I whatever, and he's laying there, and I see he has lipstick on, and he was like one of these guys that, I mean, there's no way. He's a tough guy, kind of. His corpse, you could see his lips were blue, and they put some lipstick over it, but you can still see the blue lips. And I'm like, what the hell are we doing here? He's just laying there, this slab of, human meat that's no longer inhabited by a soul. And I'm like, he's not here. Like we're sitting in front of him, and people are going up and touching his hands, and I look at him, I'm like, that's not him. Like so. His soul had left, and I had enough, I couldn't articulate it as a 10-year-old kid. I mean, the way I would now, but his soul was gone, right? And so that to me was evidence of a soul, like whatever was my grandfather was no longer there. It's just, so you see the dead body to realize Elvis has left the building. It's a confirmation that that person's no longer here. You can contact their soul, but you're not supposed to keep it around. That's why they burn the body in India and various places, because the soul comes back sometimes, because it gets stuck here, lost, the way people die, and it hangs around the body, and then it needs to move on. And if you're supposed to be sad for a couple of days, and then you wish the soul well, and so it can move on to its next, iteration or whatever it is, its next its next incarnation here or somewhere else or whatever, because its time here is done, and you don't want the soul to have to linger because you can't get over its death, the person's death, no matter how great the person. You have to send them on their way for their sake, right? Just it's an act of selflessness, and you can't cling to it. So getting back to it, so any religion that starts off good or whatever, any system of connecting to God has to acknowledge a soul, and that the divinity is within you. So you have a soul, but you're not willfully connecting with it. So it really becomes the system that the religion gives you to connect to God, right? And so, I know in terms of religions, I know the Christian system the best. And so what the Christian system says is that if you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and so there's a few things that go with it. The baptism is pretty much universally done because of John the Baptist. That you have water, which is just regular water. Of course, the Catholic Church, they have these little jars of holy water that people stick their grimy hands into. And it just sits there, like stagnant water. It's like these little marble bowls that when you come into the church, they have them, and you put your hands in the water, and you do the sign of the cross and touch the water to your forehead and your chest and your two arms. You make a cross from your, forehead where probably the third eye is, down to your belly, up to your shoulders. And that's, these very symbolic, but not really much of anything, but you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and he's going to get you to heaven. Like you vow, some loyalty to him, whatever that means. And then when you die, you're going to go to heaven. Like that's the That's the promise. But, you know, like there's various holes in the thing, right? It's not what Jesus did himself. Jesus meditated, and there's lots of evidence to support that. So there's no meditation in these religions. And what Jesus did to connect to God is different from what you're doing. And so it's like he can't meditate for you, which is something, whatever. But that's the system, right? That's you're gonna the goal of the system is to get to heaven, right? That's the goal. And to achieve that goal, you have to accept Jesus. So that's that's that. Like, and that's really not very a definable thing, what that means to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, because people vow, people take wedding vows. You vow, yeah, I'm going to be with you the rest of your life, and then 3 divorces later, right? So making a proclamation or saying words doesn't make it so. Like you saying, I accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, does not make it that you do that. You could be doing that because there's peer pressure. You could be saying it with not knowing what it means. You could mean it in the moment, but then, first time you get cancer or some shit like that, you're like, what the fuck, Jesus, right? So, like these things, right? So it's not a real system. And I could go through all the various religions and talk about their systems, but I don't know them, and like each religion has its own system. Like this is the goal, go to heaven, this thing, that thing, whatever. There's this etheric place. And the other aspect is if you don't, do this, you're going to hell. And so the goal is also to keep yourself out of hell. The fear of hell is, some people it's the lure of heaven, the promise of heaven. Some people it's the fear of hell. So these are the things this is a part of the thing where the religion controls you based in fear and temptation. And so I'm going to read Babaji's first chapter of Reality at Dawn, which is called Religion, which is, more towards what they do in India, which is about the control system. And so, it's very bogus. Like, again, this idea of a past life and a future life has been taken away from the Christian tradition because if you have those things, they can't control you, right? If you know you're going to have a future life, then they can't say it's a, the important part of this, the dogma, is that it's a what-off. Like the hell versus the hell heaven, paradox or pressure, the pressure of avoiding hell and going and going to heaven is a one-time deal. Like it's a one and done. There's no, you have this one life, and if you don't get it, you're fucked. And so that's the selling point, right? That's the, this is the, we're talking about the method. What's the method behind the religion, right? And so, I had this experience of being in a spiritual organization where, spiritual organization is there to connect you to the divinity within you. And there's various methods for that. Like there's, I think it's called Vipassana yoga. And what they do is they sit and meditate, and it's like for 12 hours. And you're supposed to be really uncomfortable physically, and the physical discomfort and the pain eventually creates an opening to you to just like detach from your body. It just breaks you down. It's like endurance, and there's a lot of physicality to it. And I knew this young guy who did it, who was a farmer, and it was back when I was a preceptor, and I'm like, trying to say, look, you should try our thing. Actually, I wasn't a preceptor then, but doing the Sahaj Marg system. I was trying to say, why don't you try our thing? Because it's not, you forget about your body, right? Because I, felt like, the Sahaj Marg system, its philosophy and method is so much better than that, which I'll discuss in a bit, right? But, you have these religions like Christianity that there are legitimate saints that come out of it, even with a flawed system. And those people transcend the religion, the bullshit, methods that you're given. And just because they're talent. So this idea of the one true religion, but really it's a big part of it is how talented a person is and how devoted they are to God And they will find a way through their bogus religion to become spiritual and do what Jesus did. Because Jesus transcended his religion, right? Jesus came in as a Jew, and he transcended that. He realized his religion was bullshit, and he became a spiritual person. So he went from a religious follower who follows these teachings that are, many times bogus, and if they're not bogus, they just lose their meaning, right? A lot of times there's these things that people do, mantras in India, spiritual practices that were good for a time when a certain person was alive, a certain time of period in history, but they lose their essence and people start doing them in the wrong way. Like people don't do them the way that they were originally done over time, the game telephone. And so, you do have these higher developed souls in any religion that find a way to go beyond the limitations of the religion itself and become spiritual people and connect to God directly. And so, there's a method that they use. There's something that happens, a shift in consciousness. Many times it's not something that they can describe because it happens on an etheric level. It happens on a soul level. And it's not something where there's some physical instructions. In terms of even meditation, it's not just sitting there with your eyes closed. Like you have to be, you have to shift into a different level of consciousness. It's like, those magic eye books where there's a hologram. And until you see it, you doubt that it exists, right? Other people are like, oh, I see it. And you're like, do you really see it? Like, I don't see it. So what are you seeing that I'm not seeing? And that's like a metaphor for spirituality, that there's, something that happens, and it happens not where you can control it, like through concentration. I'm gonna see God, right? I'm gonna experience God. Like it's, you have to be able to, like, let it happen, right? The best jump shot is one that you're not thinking, like, but make sure you're doing, like, if you're playing basketball or, any sport that I play, once in a while we go to Top Golf, and I'm a pretty good natural athlete, and for golf I just never liked it. I like being on the golf course, and I like hitting things, but I couldn't control where the ball would go, right? And the best thing is the drive where you hit the ball far, and I had a hook. The ball would hook off to the left, and if I could have taken some golf lessons and and whatever, change my swing. But it's a slice to the left or a hook to the right. I don't know, but it would just whatever spin I was putting on the ball, it would hook. And when I hit the ball great, like it's you can't recreate that on every shot, and so like there would just be times that you would just hit it right with baseball or whatever, any of these sports. Sometimes you just throw a great pass, like the perfect pass, even with a frisbee, which is easier to control the frisbee. But like you just make a good throw. Like that's what they would say. Make a good throw in baseball with this velocity and spin and things. And like that whole thing is a level of spiritual, like kind of letting go, doing the work to get the right proper form. In your jump shot, in your you need to know how to like throw like a one-handed like a split finger fastball, all these things. But once in a while you just make this, you bend it like Beckham, right? It's just and it's not something you can control, right? Like you see some of the shots like Steph Curry's makes and these things, some of these elevated things that people do. And like I've made incredible shots and hit incredible golf balls, like that's without much skill in terms of golf. And you're like, wow, I wish I could do that every time. And it's a whole thing like goes into it. It's like just penetrating to a different level. And some of it is, letting it flow through you, like being in the zone, like people say, and how to get into that, right? How to, transcend the mental thinking about it, but also, you have to put work and effort and develop muscle memory and, the practice levels and things, the training that goes on in athletics. And so, I recently have been making videos about finding morel mushrooms. And my wife, I didn't even know morel mushrooms existed until my wife took me and my family out. We went to like the woods, and she said we should look for mushrooms while we're here. We're going for a hike, and we were like, "What's that?" And then we came home one day, and my son was like, "I think there's morel mushrooms in our driveway," because my wife had showed us pictures, and there were. Like I was like, "No way!" And there were, and we have them in our yard. And I just did some videos about them, and um, there was a period where we came home from a vacation last year, and there was a bunch of them, and I was finding them left and right. And my wife's like, "Oh, you're naturally good at finding them," because they're hard to see, and we have our lawn is usually pretty long by the time the morels are up, and there are leaves from last year that'll be there, and the morels are the same color as the dried leaves, and so it's a vast area, and sometimes your eyes will just pass over them. But there was times where I was this year that I was talking to my wife on the phone, and I was just walking around the yard with my dogs. I'd be like, "Oh, there's one." It was like I wasn't even looking. It was like a moment where, I'm not really remembering what I'm doing. Like I forget I'm looking for them, and then I'll see them. Like it's just as soon as I let go of the trying to force myself or will myself to see them, But also I know kind of the way that the mushrooms are really underground, and they have these ones that come up to the mushrooms are like some kind of the sexual organ, like the reproductive part of them coming up to the surface, right? And so there's like veins of mycelium underneath the ground where there's the mushrooms will follow these veins, and I kind of so there's both things are there, like a skill level and understanding of what you're looking for, and then letting go and seeing the magic eye, seeing the hologram, and just penetrating to a deeper level, which I've experienced like recently in my meditations. Like after this will be my 32nd year of meditating under the Sahaj Marg system, and I just have like penetrated to a different level of consciousness. And I can't, it's not something I can control, but it's like wax on, wax off these things where you're doing some sort of other activity. These martial arts, these Shaolin temples would train people. There's this great thing I saw at PBS. It was like this, somebody had put together like somebody's telling a story, and they have some of these images. Sometimes they're still photos, sometimes they're, you see like they're talking about how this kid's going to train with his Shaolin temple, and they show him pounding his fists into sand, and then doing work like washing dishes and shit, and entry level like hazing that you would do to get into an organization, doing shit work or whatever. And he comes back to his home, and he's been doing all these things, and they're like, "So what do you learn? Show us something. Show us your kung fu," right? And he just like after like a day or so, he snaps and says, "It's a fraud, and I'm not learning anything." And he slams his hands down on a big butcher block, and it breaks in half. And he's quit. He's come home. He's quit. And everyone's asking him, like, it's this honor that he got to be this, But he was doing all these things that didn't, relate to. He wasn't doing kung fu training, but somehow, when he slammed his hands into the table, he now had this, this ability, and it split the thing in half, right? And so, like, what I'm talking about is, willful effort and devotion, and and then you go through shit, you go through difficulties, and you penetrate to a different level. So there's that element where any system, any religious system, if you have enough talent and you have enough devotion and you have enough, samskaras, past impressions from previous existences, you've built up some spiritual capital, you'll find, saints in all these different religions. These people who have cracked the code, who have, gone up a level or whatever it is, right? Who have ascended to a higher understanding and relationship with God in that shitty religion, in that religion that's deeply flawed because it's a system of control and materialism, right? And I can speak about this with level of experiences, my personal, whatever it is, spiritual evolution, and coming from a system where, before I did the Sahaj Marg meditation, I was under functioning. I was like a low functioning, underachieving, lost person. And there's various things that happen. I was in a Rahu period in the Vedic astrology and things that were, that's part of a plan, but also, the Sahaj Marg system was transformative for me, the meditation that I do. But in this system, I had the benefit of being around a living master, a higher developed soul, who'd crack the code, on the highest level. And then other saints, higher developed people that had, benefited from the system. And then the fourth master of the system got corrupt, and dodgy, this clown, and, failed. And then is turning into a religion. So I had the great experience being around a living spiritual system that enhanced people's ability to connect to the divinity within them. In this, in every possible way. An organization that existed for one purpose. And then watching it turn into a shit religion, where it's about control and money and power and bullshit. That's, the opposite of what it blocks your ability to connect to God, right? Where I had to, transcend that and the organization itself, because it is shit the bed. Like this guy running into the ground. He's, I would like to call it a cult, but it's too stupid. He's too stupid. The guy who runs it now to pull off a cult. But I saw it happen. So I had, in this life, I've had that experience of having the blessing to be around something real. Of course, I grew up in a religion as well. I was a Catholic, and, my mom had, this is another example of that. So my parents had prayer meetings at our house. And they used to pray, and, it was similar to meditation. My mom ended up doing the Sahaj Marg meditation. She felt the energy and benefited from it for some period of time. But she had these people come over, and there was 4 or 5 nuns. And there was one who was known as Sister Saint Anne. And she was from Lithuania, but, she spoke like with an American. I mean, she had a very little accent. And she was like this 80-some-odd-year-old woman. And she just had this spiritual, you could see like she glowed a little bit. There was these other nuns, and they were all, but they all recognized her as, a real one, like a real spiritual person. And, my mom, I also, she definitely felt, she was a spiritual person, not a religious person, a spiritual one. She wasn't just there, we were counting your moments at church, watching your watch, and can't wait to get the fuck out of there, because everybody in church is having a different experience, right? Some people are being dragged there. Some people are, they fucked up, and they went out and they got drunk and cheated on their wives, and now they're, they have to go to church every Sunday, shit like that, right? There's all, they're all having their own, their church experience is different. Why they're there. Some people are there to gossip. Some people are there for the socialization, whatever. Friends there, some people feel God. Like some people are, and again, it's all based in people's talent and their orientation and, whatever they're there for, right? Whatever their personal goals are, whatever that's binding them to the religion. Some people are afraid to leave because, their family does it, and it's just something that, they don't like it, but they endure it. And then some people are actually feeling some presence of God, and each person, it's on their own level of that, right? Because there's many levels of your spiritual journey. But then the other aspect of it is what they're selling you, like heaven and hell, and what the religion benefits from your, money and your work and your, whatever you're doing for the religion, right? The Mormon religion, they pay, these Mormon missionaries are paying to go and expand the religion. They're going door to door selling this thing, and they're paying for their privilege. They're not getting compensated, right? These missionaries. And so there's, what are you doing for the religion? What are you doing for the organization? How are they benefiting? What's the deal? What are you getting from them? And what are they getting from you, right? And so, and what do they promise you? That's the other thing. The promises that, the false promises that you get from religion. So one of the things, and I don't think I've talked about this, some of these stories, at least not a lot, In the Sahaj Marg tradition, there are two goals. There's liberation and mergence with God, where you merge back into the source. You return to the source. The Sanskrit word is mukti, for liberation, and layavasta for emergence into God. And these are well-known goals in the yogic tradition. And in Sahaj Marg, there's these spiritual points that you go up into. Like there's like, like if you're getting a black belt, like there's these 5 heart points where your soul exists in point 1, then it's moved to point 2. And with each one of these, with each one of these spiritual points, as you move through these, there's various spiritual points. There's levels of consciousness shift and levels of, that you can document that there are changes in you, right? And the last point is called the central region, which is the base of your skull. And so one of the differences between the Sahaj Marg system and traditional religions, like there are these elements to it where you wouldn't say these things if you're selling them. And so the second master of the system merges in the central region. So he's reached this goal. And he's intercommuning with the previous master who had died years earlier. And he says to him, is that it? Is that all there is? Is this it? Like this is what I work for and you work for? This is what we've been working for? Because it's really subtle. It's not some, profound drug experience. It's very subtle. Like when you achieve God, God is subtle. And so you have to become more and more subtle yourself, more and more simple, as a person, more refined. And, love is subtle. Divine energy, God energy is subtle. It's the most subtle thing. And so, gross things are exciting. Gross, heavy things. Excitement is, the emotional excitement and, things that have a big experience, things that, we like to be stimulated. And, the kind of stimulation is like, it has to escalate, right? What stimulated you before, this is like the idea of a gateway drug. What stimulated you before isn't as stimulating, like people who are thrill seekers, which is, the opposite of God. You want to feel fear, you want to feel, these lower level emotions. And so what scared you as a thrill seeker jumping out of an airplane, what is the next level, right? People who have to have those kind of, they're like dead inside and they have to have, just to feel alive, they have to do, sociopaths. And so God is on the opposite spectrum of that, where you become more subtle. And so Babaji said to Lalaji, is that all? Like, this is what, holy shit, this is all there is? Like, he was surprised, and which is, not something you want to hear when you're pursuing something that's difficult to achieve, right? That when you get there, it's, I would say a letdown. Like, in terms of selling you to do Sahaj Marg, this is what Babaji said, his experience with reaching the goal. And so Lalaji says back to him, well, if this condition is so insignificant, why don't I withdraw it from you? If this is all it is, if you're disappointed, why don't you take, and Babaji said, I would rather die. So the condition, and this was discussed by the third master of the system, and he said it's condition defined by that it's so insignificant that it seems disappointing, but once you've achieved that, you would rather die than have the thing taken away. Like it's, it's not some explosive, huge orgasmic kind of, pleasure-based experience, fireworks, but it's like something that once you have it, once you've attained it, you would never, want it to be withdrawn. You would never want to descend back down to the more grosser, mundane aspect of life where there is excitement, right? Where there is, explosive type of things. There was also a discussion between the third master and the second master where the second master said, if everyone knew what this thing was about, there would only be the 3 of us. This idea that, how much you have to give up, how much you have to sacrifice for God, how much you have to give up of your own personal ability to choose to do the wrong thing. all the things that you have to endure to reach the goal. If people knew what they were getting into, they wouldn't do it. It would be too much for them. It would overwhelm them. Having the, you're able to experience the end condition in the meditations, and that's another great thing about the Sahaj Marg system, that you'll get these brief moments where you experience the end goal from your position, and when you do that, it's amazing, because it's the contrast. I was drinking a lot, using drugs, and eating shit foods like health fast foods when I was in college, and my body started to break down. And so I was like, I don't feel good. And my brother was doing macrobiotic eating, which is a weird kind of a diet. But it was healthier than what I was doing, and I started doing it, and I felt amazing. People experience this, where you are eating toxic foods and you're living a shit lifestyle, and you start to change that. I was already exercising, so that wasn't. But when people start, doing things like exercising, you feel great, but it only lasts for a month or two, because then it just becomes normal. Feeling great and feeling much better than you did before when you were forcing toxins into your body. And then when, there's that relief of, going from something bad to something good, but that good becomes your normal, it's what you do every day, and then you don't have that rush of the contrast between what you were doing that was hurting you and then living in a healthy way. And so that's the issue. As you ascend in your spiritual journey, you reach higher levels, but that just becomes what you feel like all the time. And you don't realize, you don't appreciate where you were before. And then when you go through these cleanings in the Sahaj Marg system, something heavy is removed. I went through this really difficult period where, everybody was kind of turning on me, and I was going through a divorce, and it was just all these goals and all these things we were trying to achieve just ended. My family was decimated, and I was physically, I was stressed out and having to reinvent myself and my family and all these things. And, this is when the YouTube channel took off. There's all these things. That was added a level of stress as well, and I mean, it was a good thing, but it was also whatever. And, I went through this cleaning. I was doing a lot of these sittings, and I went through this epic cleaning, which is what it's called in Sahaj Marg system. And I got as many individual sittings as I could, and I prayed, and I did these group meditations, and I was meditating 3-4 times a day, and then one day it was just gone. And I realized I had brought into this life a bitterness towards God, a frustration. And, once that was gone, I felt like my serotonin levels went up. Like I felt amazing. And, that's just what I feel like all the time now. It's, I can still remember the contrast, because it was only, it was in 2015. It was 10 years ago, but still, it's very vivid for me. And it keeps me, it's one of those things that, keeps me going, because I've had confidence in the cleaning process. But, it doesn't feel as good now as it did then, because how bad I felt before, how frustrated my life had been up to that point. Because if you have a bitterness towards God, then you're always going to have failure and frustration, and you're going to be, and you're going to be mad at God for it, right? Some level of victim consciousness. And so I couldn't move forward and be successful and, live a good life with that level of negativity. And having that removed, it was just amazing. But again, things move on. And so when you finally reach the goal, it's just normal for you to feel that way. But some sense of you knows that you don't want to go back. And so that's one of the real things about Sahaj Marg. They don't, say that you're going to be in heaven with 70 virgins and a mule and everything's going to be blissful and pleasurable, because that's not reality. That doesn't exist. The other thing that Sahaj Marg says is that when you die and you go to a higher place, or whatever you do, you're still going to work. There's no this idea of going to heaven and it's a vacation. It's a bullshit thing, because without your body, how bored you get on vacation. You see what happens to people when they retire. When they don't have any, my dad complained about his job as a guidance counselor constantly. He complained about the commute, and he was looking forward to his retirement. But he retired and he just went crazy. Like he just, he sucked at golf, going back to golf, but he thought he was going to play golf regularly, and he sucked at it. Like, I was better than him and I barely played. And he didn't really like it. And he didn't have friends in the social system. And he didn't have hobbies. And so when he died, he had nothing. He'd been watching TV and eating, which, he ends up, his eyesight goes, when I saw him last, and he couldn't eat anymore because he had irritable bowel syndrome. So, like, whatever he had left in terms of, things that he liked to do, he couldn't do them anymore. And he was like, he just went nuts. He still, went crazy. Like, he, no longer had a purpose. And he was kind of, none of my, I have a brother and 3 sisters. And, he had grandkids, and no one would go to him for advice or, like, he sucked as a person. Like, no one wanted to be around him. He wasn't likable. And so, he had nothing. Like, he had no purpose. So, as shitty as his job was for him, you see this with people when they retire. Like, they just, one of the things that Master Chargy said, third master of the Sahaj Marg system, is that your difficulties and your miseries bind your personality together. This is another reason why difficulties are this miseries is divine blessings, which is another thing about the Sahaj Marg system. That miseries are good things. Like, you're not going to, most religious systems promise you relief from miseries. If you do the system, you won't suffer. But, miseries are supposed to be a good thing. They're divine blessings. And one of the reasons they're divine blessings is when you have difficulties, it binds your personality together. You have to overcome things. It's like, you have it's like your family's going through something and you have to rally together. But it does that internally for your system. Like, when you have goals and you have things you have to achieve, it keeps you going. It keeps you waking up in the morning and functioning, and it gives you purpose. Like, not having goals. I went through a period of my life where I had no goals, and it was horrible. Like, when you have no ambition, there's no reason to get up in the morning. And you have these ultra rich people that don't have difficulties because everything can be solved, other than health issues that are, cancer or something. Most of their problems can be solved, and they don't, they don't have to get up and do some job and whatever, even as shitty as jobs can be. These people, and you see, that's why really rich people go crazy, because they don't have a purpose. They need a hobby. Then they need a spiritual goal or something. And really, everyone should have a spiritual goal, because that's the most important thing to have. You have to have something you're working for on a spiritual level. You have your material goals, and you have your things you're doing, like, building a garden, growing food, and whatever it is, right? These things. But also, it's a spiritual goal, which is, more important. And lots of these religions, they don't really give you a real spiritual goal. Like Christianity, it's the promise of heaven. But it's not a goal that you're achieving, because that's something Jesus is doing for you. And, I'm contrasting this stuff with Sahaj Marg because it's important, because, like, if you have a real thing, with a real system, with a real method, they don't lie to you about sugarcoat things for you. In the Sahaj Marg system, the master of the system was helped to accelerate a person's spiritual evolution if they were working hard and doing whatever. And so they were able to go through these various, the spiritual yatra, the journey of these spiritual points, in a way that's faster than, just by self-effort. But there were people, many of them, who fell. There was this thing called spiritual gravity, where people were able to reach the mind region. And these spiritual points coincide with the goal of liberation. So you have these 13 points. And when you reach point 6, which is the third eye, and that's to be avoided because it's a power point, but it's really the 7th point in the mind region. You now are free from future incarnations on Earth, based in being mandatory, where you're trapped here in the cycle of rebirth and death and rebirth. Now you can come back, but you're not stuck here. You're not bound to planet Earth. If your soul chooses to come back here for its own purposes, where reasons they are, then that can happen, but you're not stuck here. And that coincides with the 7th point. And then merging to the source with the last point, the 13th point. And there are people who achieved the central region. Master Chargy's father, who was sort of gifted it, And he fell because he got so obsessed with stamp collecting, a very mundane, boring activity, that the concentration on materialism and the obsession he had, the hobby, pulled him out, which is kind of a sad thing to hear because it's so innocent. Like a stamp collection isn't really a bad thing, right? And then there was another guy, Casey Varachari, was a higher developed, religious scholar who got jealous and fell. And so that's the other thing. Like falling is a part of it. So, there's no blank promises or blank checks, and it's something that you always have to work for. And when you die, you're going to do more work. You're going to go to heaven and work for God. Not heaven, but a etheric world, and work for God. And there's no sense of a permanent vacation or pleasure or these things. Just more of the same. Like it's just, it's a more realistic. I mean, it's not some, where you're being sold a line of shit, right? Because, the some great fantasy. Because, you know what I mean. If you're selling religion to people, that's not what you would hear, right? You wouldn't hear this thing about, when you reach the goal, you're going to be disappointed. And if you don't continuously do work and contribute and move forward, you're going to fall back down and these things, right? It's just, and you have to do things. Like you're going to have to, the other thing is you have to develop character qualities, which is 100% your job. The system itself can't give you character qualities. It can remove some of the negative tendencies through the cleaning process, but you have to work to have a good character. You have to confront yourself when you're lying and you're cheating and we're doing stupid shit. That you have to say, hey, I'm not being a good, it's not something where they can force that on you. You have to come to that yourself, or you have to, look yourself in the mirror and say, I have to be a better person. And you have to do that consistently. It's like it's work. Like it's just a lot of work. It's selling you something where, the system itself enhances your ability to connect to God, but you have to participate. So this is, going back to this idea of the one true religion. You need two things. You need the best system, and I believe the Sahaj Marg system is the best system because it's there's adaptations that are possible in the future that have already happened to it to help it make it better, like for the need of the time and the need of the people. But you can have the best system, but are you the best person? Are you willing to do your path, right? So it's a combination of having a method, a quality method, the best method, the true method, the vertical path to your connection to God, and then also your commitment, because there's the human error and human failure and human, it's an ego versus soul. Like people are, are they going to embrace their souls and reach for the higher, or are they going to, fall down and make worse choices, bad choices based in their egotistical pursuits of pleasure and selfishness and things. So you have to find the right system. You pray to God to find the right system, and then you have to become the right person. You have to be, you have to have spiritual talent, but you have to work assiduously. You have to be a dog. Have to have dogged effort. When it's needed, and you have to let go when that's needed. And you have to, if you have to, do the thing. You have to beat the video game, right? You have to, put in the hours and commit and figure it out. You have to get it done. You have to make the shot, right? Like you have to deliver. Like you have to, it's not like you're trying or toiling. You have to come through. You have to, in these big moments, you have to, make the choice and rise to the level, rise to the occasion, and deliver to whatever's asked of you in that circumstance, which is, for most people, it just doesn't happen. I mean, people can do it to whatever level, and I'm not speaking from being successful myself at it. I'm still in the working to get it done, but I understand this from everything I've seen about being successful. It's doing the work and putting in the sacrifice, but it's also letting go and rising to the moment. And there's a lot going into it, right? It's not you can use your will force when it's necessary, and then sometimes you just have to ride the flow of things. And it's just there's figuring out in each specific situation what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it, and then finding a way to be successful. And on an etheric level, on a spiritual level, it's much more difficult than material success. So anyways, I want to take a break. I'm going to go eat breakfast, but then I'm going to come back and read Babaji's chapter on religion, and then, I'll wrap this thing up. Okay, so I went for a walk with my wife, and I, ate breakfast. And oftentimes when I talk for close to an hour, getting into the hour range, 45 minutes, I sort of fade out, and I miss some of the most important points I was going to make. So, what I was going to say about this is the idea of one true religion is, that somehow you as a human being and as an organization, or somebody as a human being or an organization of people, can speak for God. Like you're the gatekeepers between other people and God. And it's the fucking worst possible idea and scam out there. It's the most devious scam. It's the one that has the most devastating effects because it affects people on a soul level, which is eternal, no matter how bad, how abusive something is on a material level, how shitty it is, crimes and, abuse and, whatever, things done to children, murder, all these things, sexual abuse, all these negative things that people do, poisoning, whatever, destroying habitat, even destroying the world to some extent. Making the world uninhabitable is probably the worst thing, right? In the material plane of existence. Anything to do with the soul is worse because your soul is eternal. So it's not just, even a billion years, it's eternal and negatively affecting the path of a soul or, any of these things that religions end up doing. So that's why they're the worst because it affects people's understanding of God. It turns people against God, affects their relationship with God. So it's the worst. And it's so arrogant to think that human beings can claim trademark or copyrights for God, right? They can say whatever things about their system or their techniques or something, but, to claim that they are the gatekeepers between you and God and you have to bow before them and serve them and do whatever they ask of you, demand of you, because without them you can't, you're not going to heaven or whatever it is. It's the fucking worst, right? And so, like I was saying, there's a method within each of these systems and how you connect to God, right? If you go through each religion, just like with the psychological world, there's different models of how healing happens and how the psychological model views people. How does it say, this whole, these different important points to choosing the right psychological, if you're going to get counseling, your counselor is going to come from a perspective based in these different models of psychological makeup and their view on what is a human being, how does change happen, how does a human being change, what is a human being's psychological makeup. Like behaviorists, it's all rewards and punishment, right? Pavlov's dog. It's all stimulus and consequences and choice, right? And that's why these behavioral management programs are at prisons and treatment centers and things, and these different models. Like Freud has a different model with the Oedipus and Electra complex, and this is how people develop, right? So there's these different ways of viewing human beings and what's inside a human being and how best to help a human being if they're having issues on a psychological level. And so, when I went to my master's degree in counseling, we covered these different models, and it was a well done course study that showed you, what the model thinks, what are their techniques, how do they think healing happens, these are the things, what's their philosophy. And so within spiritual traditions, there is a path to a gateway to connect to God. How does it work? Meditation being, prayer and meditation being the two most shared understanding, but then there's all these other things, right? They add other things, other types of ways to connect to divinity. And so when they say this is the only way to get to God, when most religions say that in one form or another, this is the only way, not the best way, the only way, right? But it's all the same way, right? Human beings have a way of connecting to God. I mean, meditation's a part of it, and there's various ways that each person specifically is designed to connect to their soul, and it's you develop these abilities over many lives as you mature and things like this. You take these things with you because it happens on an etheric level, but you have to transcend the material existence. All these things I was talking about earlier, where you're not trying. You're not attempting. You just gotta, like, sort of. It's like, when you let yourself go, you're standing on a dock or a diving board, and you let yourself fall into the water, right? It's like that, but it's going up instead of down, and now you're in water instead of, it's like diving into the water, right? But there's a moment between when you leap, which is an act of will, to where gravity takes over and you're flying through the air, and then you land in the water, and that's, there's just like falling asleep, there's this, letting go of consciousness, and at that moment where you go from being awake and conscious, although you might be sleepy, your eyelids are getting heavy, these things, but then you plunge into sleep, right? So, there's this element, and that can't be copyrighted or trademarked by any organization. They could guide you on how to do that if they had the methods to do that. They can create environments where it's more conducive, a spiritual place, a holy place where, there's places that are just naturally vibratorily better, by the ocean and by the mountains where people go and, connect to nature and connect to these things, camping outside in various places. Some places have, these spiritual power points, hot spots, and then these buildings where you have a saint, a higher developed soul. If you go over somebody's house who's a practitioner of the Sahaj Marg system, you can feel the energy in their house from the transmission, the cleaning. They create these ashrams. And so you can do these things to facilitate the connection, but each person has to walk through that door themselves, and it's a personal choice, and nobody can copyright it, and nobody can make you do it. Nobody, can prevent you from doing it. It's inside of you. So it's not, these religions that say they're the one true religion, it's all bullshit. When Christianity says the only way to get to God is through the Son, to get to the Father through the Son. Why? Because somebody said it. Like it's blasphemy, right? It's making bullshit up and saying human beings can claim, prevent your way from heaven, can charge you a fee to get to heaven, right? Like it's bullshit. Like it doesn't exist. Like that can't exist. And so within any spiritual type of adventure, I mean, your individual, an individual has the capacity to connect to divinity within themselves. It's just limited to, it's always better to have support, training, guides, people lead you along the path, people will oversee your journey. Those things are always better. It's like going, trying to travel from New York to California without a map, right? And without a compass, and you're just driving random roads or being blind, you're just driving on roads that are, like random, and hopefully you'll make it west at some point, right? But if you have a path that's laid out in front of you, you have people overseeing it, benevolently, doing God's work without any thought of their personal gain or profit from that, these things. That's what people need to have in terms of, guides, spiritual masters and guides or gurus, is somebody who's getting nothing out of it for themselves. They're doing it for, as payment for their own spiritual evolution, as, paying it forward. And like I was saying about the Sahaj Marg system, when it was working, the organization, you go to these gatherings and you'd suffer to some extent in the beginning. Like, I'm in one gathering now, but it's not the same. It's not as good as it was when there's actually other people are going to India. But either way, there's a process where it's not like all just some, acid trip or something like that. It's actually, there's difficulties, material difficulties, physical problems, often pain and suffering, that go on before the gathering. Then there's like cleaning that comes from that helps, remove some of the negative things that are in people's internal systems that's blocking their path. And through the process of this cleaning, it helps them navigate through all of that stuff. And then there's, the final outcome where a person makes it to where their intended goal and their, the eventual inevitable spiritual outcome. And so, that's another thing, like I was saying earlier, what happens where they're, again, they don't have to tell you all the bad stuff coming in. Like they don't have to say you're going to suffer and these things. Like no one, when you're talking about people about Sahaj Marg, you're like, miseries is divine blessings. No one's going to buy into that shit. So you don't want to exclude them by, selling it as something bad, right? Because it's hard for people to understand that you have to experience the inner condition and the transformation to value the misery, right? The misery is just misery until you feel like you feel grateful for a positive outcome. But the fact that it's there and they're not hiding it, they're not maybe telling you on the first day, but it's not like it's something that, as you go through it, you start to go through what's called cleaning. You're told, yeah, this is normal. It's not like, oh, this is just something that like when people say, you promised me bliss, right? And the Sahaj Marg system doesn't promise bliss. It promises connection to God and working for God and service, right? And so whatever reason you come into it, you don't sleep well, you're stressed out, whatever things are going on, feeling lost, so you're hopeless, these things without a purpose, no goal, whatever. Reasons people come into the thing. Some inner craving for divinity, the unexplained inner craving for a connection to divinity, these types of things. But people come into it for a reason, and then it ends up helping you as you see benefit for miseries, which you avoided up to this point in your life, where you have miseries and you're like, what's wrong? Why is this happening? Why is God punishing me? This isn't fair. These kind of things. Why am I suffering these feelings that people have? Where you'll say, well, how is this benefiting me? Why should how can I be grateful for this? What is this silver lining in this thing, right? Why is this was this instead of being a curse, this is a gift from God? It's changing one's perspective based in seeing it work, like seeing it actually, like how this is effective, right? And being able to have experience of it now while you're living, not some promise, or when you die, this is what's going to happen. You can't, like another reference to the Heretic movie. Death is not, you can experience God now. Anyway, so let me read this thing from Babaji here. Okay, so the second master of the Sahaj Marg system was not an educated man, and he never thought of himself as an author or somebody who would write a book. But he was tasked with doing so because people wanted books, and so he went into a super conscious sort of state and channeled these books. And the one that's most accessible, it's maybe to be considered the Bible of Sahaj Marg, is a 100-page book called Reality at Dawn that kind of lays out the practice. It's available online. I'm looking at a PDF. There's a couple of versions of it out there online. But this is, the first chapter is called Religion, and it really didn't strike me when I first read it. Like the rest of the book, I was like, more applied to my situation. But, since then I have really valued it because he's defining the problem with godly pursuit. And a lot of it has to do with what's going on in India, because he was in India and they have a lot, religion's such a big thing there, and there's so much corruption and fake gurus and things like this. So he says this, Chapter 1, Religion. The quest of mankind ever since its birth has been to worship God, to unravel the mysteries behind the outward appearances, and to grasp the fundamental truth. This is the genesis of religion. The worshipper has before his eyes the eternal bliss of paradise, or some similar view, which he aims at in his final approach. There have thus arisen religions in the world with their prescribed forms and rituals, based on personal practical experiences of their great founders. So let me read that again. I kind of butchered that. There have thus arisen religions in the world with their prescribed forms and rituals based upon the practical experiences of their great founders. But after the lapse of thousands of years, when the entire surroundings have changed and life has undergone a radical transformation, the same old forms and principles are being adhered to. This is what I'm talking about. Here. The same old forms and principles are being adhered to. The outer form alone now remains intact, while the inner spirit is lost. The result is that the vehicle of the religion has become hackneyed, and it will not be wrong to say that the present-day religion has become only a relic of the past or the bones of the dead. We have really buried true religion into the grave, only we clap hands in the name of the religion and do nothing else. The real spirit is lost, and only formalities remain in its place. Outward forms and rituals are the only things that remain open to view, which are followed with extreme orthodoxy and tenacity without even the least touch of reality. The meaning, this is reality at dawn. He means connecting with the divinity within you, which is reality, right? God realization. Our faith in reality has thus diminished to the point of extinction. It is rather twisted into forms and rituals alone. Gradually, it degenerates into bigotry or prejudice, which has unfortunately become the permanent feature of the present-day religion. Our blind faith in formalities keeps us in the dark regarding the reality, and unconsciously we have developed within us a feeling of hatred against those who believe in other forms and rituals. They are consequently jealous. There are consequently jealousies and quarrels among the followers of different religions. India has achieved a political freedom, but self-independence or the freedom of soul is still wanting. The main obstacle is the want of capacity for a broader vision and free thinking. The whole atmosphere is supercharged with prejudice and rivalry. The entire structure of society and culture rests upon the same foundation. Sectional jealousies are the main causes of the downfall of our civilization. There are at least no less than 3,000 castes in India, each forming a distinct unit. These castes were originally the different guilds of workers and artisans organized in order to solve the question of division of labor. So the caste system that was, I think, brought by Krishna was that these people would be born into these, like you would be a farmer or be a blacksmith, or, you'd be these various types of work that you were going to do. And you would grow up in a household full of these people, which of course, would encompass that a soul chose this ahead of time. And it would save time in terms of like people choosing their profession and these things. But then it just developed into what's now just this prejudicial shit show of castes where it's, like it's not about that at all anymore. But today, each guild tries to cut itself off from the rest of the community, forming a separate independent unit, harboring feelings of hatred and jealousies towards the other. The whole society is thus proceeding towards disintegration. The time is now at hand when this evil shall soon cease to exist. Nature is at work to put an end to this evil. The scythe of time is unsparing. Let this serve as a warning to the ardent supporters, advocates of the caste prejudice. They cannot escape the consequences unless they mend it in time. The will of God must have its course. Prejudice is the greatest evil, rather the deadliest poison towards spiritual life. So there's a lot here. Let me reread that again. There's a lot of quotable things here in this book, and certainly for Sahaj Marg people. Prejudice is the greatest evil, rather the deadliest poison to spiritual life. It keeps one confined to himself, losing all access to a broader vision. It creates narrow-mindedness, and all prospects of development and progress are lost to those who pin their souls to it. Prejudice breeds hatred towards others and is nothing but a feeling of false superiority in the disguised form. If you nurture this evil, you thereby add one more link to the existing chain of egoism. Consequently, you remain farther away from reality. The realization of the limitless thus becomes an impossibility. Universal love, the very fundamental basis of religion, having disappeared altogether, the religion which was generally considered to be a link between man and God has now become a barrier instead. If we keep ourselves bound fast to a particular form or practice without a clear idea of its real significance and a final approach, we are probably committing the greatest blunder. God is not to be found within the fold of a particular sect. He is not confined within the certain forms or rituals, nor is he to be traced out from within the scriptures. Him we have to seek for in the innermost core of our hearts. So this is one of Babaji's fundamental teachings. Let me read that again. It's a separate quote. This is one of the greatest quotes in the system. God is not to be found within a fold of a particular religion or sect. He is not confined within the certain forms or rituals, nor is he to be traced out from within the scriptures. Him we have to seek for in the innermost core of our heart. And so going back to prejudice, the idea here is that the a godly person and a person on a spiritual path is subject to many great changes. They have to be willing to change. You have to accept that there are things in your system you have to give up. There are things in your life you have to give up, or at least transform your attitude towards them, and that there's adjustments to what you're doing. And sometimes the truth sucks. Truth of, reality sucks. And things that you are rationalizing or justifying, you have to get rid of victim consciousness, and you have to stop thinking you know everything and prejudging things, right? And so a spiritual person has to accept that change is possible for themselves or other people. And even the most unlikable people, and oftentimes it's the case that people who you really dislike, let's say I tell 10 people about Sahaj Marg, the one person who will get it will be the person I'll least likely think is like will get it, right? It's a weird thing. Like people who I, would never in a million years say that they would be a good abhyasi, a good practitioner. And out of all the people, they are the ones that do it, right? They're the ones that end up sticking with it. And so it's a very strange thing, but you have to be open to any possibility. And as long as there's life, there's a chance for change. So there's a chance for hope, even in the worst of the worst. All the people that you hate, all the, the Joe Bidens, the Donald Trumps, all these people. We expect God to forgive us of our sins, or our issues. We expect those things, that God will love us no matter what. I mean, most people have an understanding about this, but that applies to everybody. But also only if they're changing, right? Only if they're embracing it. I mean, you can't, if they're going on just doing more bad shit, then they're, I mean, you just, it's a predictable outcome that people will tend to do that. But there's times that people change. St. Paul, who was the third Master Chargy was St. Paul in a previous existence, and he remembered that moment where he fell off the horse on the road to Damascus. He had a conscious past life memory of that. But remember, he was somebody who was persecuting Christians, and then he saved the Christian church. Chargy himself said that, St. Paul, if there was no St. Paul, there would have been no church. Christianity would have folded back into Judaism and would have disappeared. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but, it is what it is. And he did the same thing for Sahaj Marg. Like his tendencies and abilities as St. Paul in that life were on display in this life, which is kind of interesting. Like the same thing he did in terms of managing the organization and these things, he had already have previous experience with it. But anyways, this idea of prejudice and thinking and the Sahaj Marg state is a state of divine ignorance where you're asking God to show you the truth in every moment. Where most of us, we look at things and we have a past experience, we have memories, we have a mind, we have a brain, and we look at things and we understand them from our past experience, and that's where prejudging comes from. We stuck our hand in a beehive, and then we oh man, we got stung, and we're like, I'll never do that again. And now you look at bees and you're like, those fuckers, those stingy things, right? That's your experience as a bee. You touch it burning, you touch your like a flame and you burn yourself, and you're like, I won't do that again, right? Like you have these things. It helps for survival. You know what things are, right? That thing will eat you. That thing is good to eat, whatever it might be. You have a reference point for it. You see it and you understand it. And it helps you guide you through your life where we find out what's dangerous, what things are going to help you, these things. And so we have these desires that come along with it, comforts and things. We choose to avoid the bad things and like the good things. And so those are all valid ways to survive and valid ways to be conscious of your life around you. But in terms of the stuff to do with prejudging on a spiritual level, it stops you from seeing the potential. Like you judge something before it happens. And then and then you judge other people, some people that could be beneficial to you. Maybe they have knowledge you don't have. Maybe they have something to offer you. But you look at them as being a piece of shit, some demographic you don't like or whatever. And so this idea that you're with God, and that through your connection to God that everything's possible, changing yourself and people changing themselves, and that you don't know what's going to happen until it happens. And prejudging stops that because you just assume you know ahead of time. And so this is where divine ignorance comes in. There's no enlightenment where you know everything, that you just look at everything with fresh eyes, and you ask God, what do I need to know today? What's to do the work that you want me to do. What do I need to know? And just go about your business that way, almost in a state of, like that movie Memento, where that guy lost his long term memory, and so you just approach everything with fresh eyes, and the only which would be complete ignorance in a bad way, unless you can connect to God in such a way where God can inform you what to do, and so you're getting it straight from the source. This is what you need to know about this subject. This is what you need to do about it, and then you just go about what God told you to do, right? So you're just looking at everything with new eyes, with fresh eyes, and that's there's the level that I described through memory and things, which is a stage, but at some point as you evolve on a spiritual level, then it goes from where you had all this knowledge to where you know nothing, but God shows you what you need to know, and you're in complete service to God, and you always do the right thing because you're not burdened by having all these prejudice and knowledge that you think you have, limited knowledge in every capacity, in every way, shape, or form, but still you think you know things that you don't, and you make choices out of faulty knowledge and limited reasonable critical thinking skills. There's a lot here in what he means by prejudice. And so then here, there are various conceptions of God. People look upon him differently according to their capacity and understanding. The most commonly accepted conception of God is eternal power, but the philosophic view goes much beyond, and includes the idea of nirguna Brahma, or intermediate absolute, which is above all multiplicity and distinctions. Which is above all multiplicity and distinctions. It is the ultimate cause of substratum of the existence, the superactive center of the entire manifestation of the absolute base. So what he's talking about here is God in the absolute form as, an idea of like something so subtle that everything else is a perversion of that, right? Like we think of good things, powerful things, but God thinks God is power, but no, God really the absence of power, right? God is strong, God is powerful, God can do everything, God is, but in like as you penetrate to the levels, God is in a sense nothing. Everything comes from God, but it's like you cut open a seed and there's nothing there in the center, but the tree comes from it, right? So this idea, the absolute, which is the multiplicity of distinctions, is the ultimate cause of the substratum of existence, the superactive center of the entire manifestation of the absolute base. It is beyond quality, activity, or consciousness. It is also known as the para-Brahma. It's also known as the para-Brahma. See, some of these things you would have to be trained in yogic philosophy or understand these terms. Para-Brahma. Brahma is the god of creation. So there's the Brahma Mandal region, which is the mind region, which I referred to earlier. There's the heart region, there's the mind region, and there's the central region. And when you get to the center, God is the most subtle. And God is without form or substance or quality. God's just pure God, the essence of love, undefinable because you can't compare it to anything else. You can't compare God to anything else. God doesn't have a peer or an equal or an opposite where you can say, that God is water, so, the opposite of being in the desert. Like if you were trying to describe water, what does it feel like being wet or being with God, being immersed in God. You would describe water as, something, right? But it would have opposites, like being wet versus being dry, right? These things, being, the difference between water and air, right? These types of things. But since God doesn't have any qualities or form, there's no way to really describe God. We see the universe with all its diversities and differentiations, and we are led to believe in its creator and controller. Okay, so some of these terms, we don't have. Christianity is so simple, and we have very little spiritual training, and so there's these vast knowledge about God in different forms, and like God is this or that, but you go to deeper levels of it, and so there's much more of this in Indian terminology. We are led to believe its creator and controller. We call him Ishwar, or
Saguna Brahma, in parentheses, determinate absolute, we think of him as a formless external existence which is omnipotent and omniscient and possesses all the finest attributes. He is the effective cause of the world, and he is also its preserver and destroyer. This is the three ideas of Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu, right? The three elements: creation, destruction, and preservation. It is only when viewed from this lower standpoint that God, as the God of religion, becomes the object of worship. This is the final approach to almost all religions. So far, God is conceived of as the Nirakar, or formless, but possessing certain attributes, right? So God has no form, and yet he has attributes. Like he's God is great. God is kind. God is, powerful, these things. And these are all, like, when you understand God is nothing, right? God is, it is the merest of existence, right? The most subtle thing in the universe. And all these qualities certainly are God. You could describe God as everything, because everything comes from God. Without God, there's nothing. And yet God himself at the base is nothing, right? And from this, this most subtle, merest, thought, or merest, whatever you would call it, like this, this slightly above nothingness, right? This, this stir, this merest thought, all this other stuff comes from. And so, it's like religions are going to want to define God as something that's appealing to you. Like if you're a warrior, you want a strong God with big muscles and a sword, right? If you're a, animal lover, then God is nature and, is sitting there with like hummingbirds flying around and butterflies and, whatever it is, right? Depending on what you believe is the higher thing. Like what do you think is, what do you worship? What appeals to you? Do you like power? Do you like nature? Do you like femininity? God as a woman, as a mother, right? What do you think is the higher qualities? And then they tailor the religion to describe God as that, so you'll follow their religion because those are things that appeal to you. This is the final approach to almost all religions. So far, God is conceived of Nirakar, or formless, but presenting certain attributes. This is in itself a difficult idea for the common folk to grasp. They therefore try to secure an easier approach by taking up to a more tangible form. Some therefore think of him as seated on the highest heaven, administering justice, benevolence to all. Others think of him as an all-pervading power controlling the universe. Thus, by degrees, we are in a way gradually drifting from the Nirakar, or formless aspect, to some tangible form, or Sakar. Much has been said in religious books about the two conceptions, the Narakar and the Sakar, the formless and then the formed God. And so you understand that they have words for these things in India. This is why India has, superior religious knowledge and history, because this doesn't exist in Christianity in the West. This idea of God as being formless, these things, right? And then, of course, the multiplicity of gods. These are cosmic functionaries, but even in the terms of Christianity, you don't worship God, you go to the Son, right? You go to the Son, not the Father. And so, there's all these ways that people have relating to God. And in India, they have a lot more of this knowledge because there's all these, there's thousands upon thousands of years of research and all these various saints and higher developed souls, and, exploring the many facets of spirituality and divinity. There's more in your eternal universe than there is in the external universe. Thus, by degrees, we are in a way gradually drifting from Narakar to formless aspect to some tangible form, or Sakar. Much has been said in the religious books about the two conceptions, the Nirakar and the Sakar, but really both the conceptions, as generally understood, are greatly misleading. Really, God is neither Narakar nor Sakar, but beyond both. Those who treat him as Sakar limit the limitless within the bounds of a form or a shape. The result is that they cultivate narrow-mindedness and remain forever within bounds. If we take him as Nirakar, the very idea brings to mind the limitations of the attributes of as creator, controller, and destroyer. Even the idea of God as power or energy is still a limited conception, like the Force in Star Wars. We now go on ahead to the idea of non-entity or zero. Thus, we are in a way somewhat away from reality. Zero is a concept that didn't exist. In mathematics all around the world, it was something that was introduced by India, right? No one understood it, something without any value, the absolute zero, right? And so this was an Indian concept. We go ahead to the idea of non-entity or zero. Still, we are in a way somewhat away from reality. What then? Expression now fails. Sufficient be it to say that we are really away from both the conceptions. We may think of ourselves to be in the right direction. So long as we remain confined within the bounds of religion, the God of religion remains in our view, and we remain entangled with one or the other view. The highest spiritual attainment is only possible when we go beyond. In fact, spirituality begins where religion ends. Religion is only a preliminary stage preparing a man for his march on the path of freedom. When he has set his foot on the path, he is then beyond the limits of religion. The end of religion is the beginning of spirituality. The end of spirituality is the beginning of reality, and the end of reality is the real bliss. When that too is gone, we have reached the destination. This is the highest mark, which is almost inexpressible in words. This is another, beautiful quote from him. The end of religion is the beginning of spirituality. The end of spirituality is the beginning of reality. The end of reality is the real bliss. When that too is gone, we have reached the destination. That is the highest mark, which is almost inexpressible in words. The worship of gods and deities is in the various forms is a crude development of the same Sakar theory. Sakar theory, God is a form. Worship of every power of nature and even of the mountains, rivers, and trees is further degradation of the same view. What a pity. Instead of worshiping the master, we are worshiping the servants, ignoring the master entirely, and we are not prepared to hear even a word against our set prejudices. The result is that today we find so many sects and creeds, each worshiping its own god or goddess in a particular way. Evidently, the goal before their eye is not even liberation, but in most cases, deliverance from some particular form of misery or some material gain. People are driven to such forms of worship either by the force of circumstances or through the faulty guidance of those who are themselves in the dark of the matters of self-realization. Lord Krishna has made it clear in the Gita that worship of gods may lead you only to their sphere only. Let me read that again. Lord Krishna has made it clear in the Gita that worship of gods may lead you at the most to their sphere only, which is limited one and far beyond the point of liberation. So if you worship the god of destruction, then you can have just destruction, right? Or if you worship any of these different, how there's even in Christianity there's Saint Christopher or whatever that's there that you watches over when you travel, or like there's these different saints you pray to for this thing or that thing, right? It's like you can thank God for everything, or say thank you apple, thank you tomato, thank you wind because I'm hot and it feels good, or thank you sun, for all these things. They're all part of God. And so going back to it, they themselves have no capacity to go beyond. The approach of their devotees beyond this point is therefore out of the question. Because that's like if there's somebody or some cosmic entity, they're limited to their job. The sun is limited to what the sun does. If you worship the sun, you can only get what's limited to the sun, and there's so much more out there beyond the sun, right? So this is the thing he's talking about. I've illustrated this point more clearly in my book, The Efficacy of Raja Yoga. He has 5 other books. They're all available in the complete works of Ramchandra in PDF form on the internet. Mechanical form of worship commonly adopted by those hankering after gods and goddesses to serve their worldly ends is also another absurdity. It is no worship at all. They only play the part of the laborer, so to say, and at the close they get their day's wages for the physical labor done. The solid material form of God entertained by them in the mind of the worshiper, with faith and devotion leads to internal grossness, and if the practice continues for a long time, they become more and more solid, barring their approach to reality. The results in such cases is evident to almost every eye, and ancient sages, finding worship of the immaterial absolute a difficult task for the masses to start with, had devised certain convenient means for their uplift. They made a start by taking up something apparent in the solid form, which the masses could easily grasp or understand. So what they would do is they would transmit divine energy into an idol. He's talking about idol worship here, or some of these other things. That's one thing he's talking about. And people would go to the idol and they would feel the energy, the love energy, the God energy, but they took it as worshiping the stone instead of it being charged, because people, most human beings even now, particularly now maybe, don't have the ability for abstract thought. So talking about God in an abstract way was just too much for them to understand. So you have people who are more primitive, people who are here for the first time, and so they have to understand God as powers, God as nature, these things. But it's only a starting point. And then, as you evolve in your capacity to understand things, and like on an abstract level, then you can understand God as not some guy sitting on a throne. God as man, right? The way that Christians define him, or God as a physical son, right? Because God is neither of those things. God is, doesn't have a physical form. And so the things which could be easily grasped or understood were different people. For the people of the lowest standard, they adopted something in the parent solid form. For others, more elevated, some abstract form, splendor, light, or any godly attribute was introduced to start with. For highly cultured minds, a subtle idea of God was enough. Thus, it was only for the people of the lowest standard that they adopted the solid form, such as pictures or images, and they too only as a temporary measure. When they attained some progress, they gave it up and embarked upon the next stage. Taking up a finer form is just like teaching writing to a baby, making her move the pen around the prints of letters. After a little practice, the process is given up, and the baby is able to write independently without the help of the prints. Thus, the solid form, or the image, was to be adopted for beginners for only a time, after which they came to the next stage. Besides, the image set up for the purpose was fully charged with spiritual force, so that those sitting by it in devotion and worship gained some of it through its constant radiation. Now persons of caliber having power to infuse the image of the spiritual force are rare, although the process of prana prastita still continues as a matter of mere form. The result is the places and images thus charged thousands of years ago have by this time almost lost all of their effect, and consequently no particular gain is derived by those going there for devotion and worship. He's talking about idols here. It is, however, beyond doubt that the process was introduced only for the people of the lowest standard, with little brain, who could not otherwise devote themselves to the Lord in any way. It is but certain that those practiced, if tenaciously followed to the last, defeats its very purpose and does not provide any spiritual advantage. The Saint Kabir has nicely expressed the idea in the following lines: "If by worshipping stone one can reach God, I shall be ready to worship a mountain. But for this purpose, the grinding stone which grinds the corn to feed the world, the world may be better." So, he's saying this stuff about idol worship, which became, again, where people just got entrenched with it, coming in life after life, worshiping the same idols and not evolving to something more subtle. To my view, those who stick to this sort of worship throughout their life are wading deep through the mire of ungodliness. It's extremely difficult to extricate them out of it. In course of time, after constant practice, they become so firmly rooted to that they cannot even think of getting away from it at any stage. They remain at a standstill. They do not want to get rid of the ideas that are already imbibed. Further, they apply their power or thought and make them stronger and more solid. Everything casts a reflection in a form similar to its own. If the thing is subtle, its reflections will also be subtle in character. And if it is gross, the reflection will likewise be gross. We concentrate on a solid thing, we are sure to become ourselves inwardly solid. Great havoc has been wrought by teachers who have presented to the ignorant masses everything they have learned from the holy books in hard and solid form. It destroys the reflective power of the mind. If one develops such a horrible state, he is gone forever. He loses his approach to the broader vision, and the capacity for further progress becomes extinct. Such a person may be compared to the frogs in a well with little fields of activity, and what they consider all and enough. They remain whirling around in a closed sphere, hemmed in on all sides. They are hammering at the same thing all their life. Stories and illustrations of gods are enough for them. When the practice continues for long, the cells of the brain are affected, and they can become saturated with thoughts which grow stronger day by day. Finding the whole nervous system is affected. The external opacity gradually creeps in and completes the work. They are now completely impervious, both within and without, to the passage for the divine light. Their approach to the innermost is completely barred. I shall prefer to call them living stones. The hardened crust which they thus develop keeps them aloof from the slightest association with anything higher or finer. They are spellbound by its effects, which they consider to be spiritual stage, although in fact they are far away from it. My personal experience in the spiritual field has revealed to me that it is pretty hard and tedious task to shatter the hard crust created by such forms of practice from the hearts of those coming to me for spiritual pursuit. If one wants to free himself from these bondages of the soul, he necessarily cleaves it off the layer of grossness, and solidity settles over his mind as a result of these stupefying practices. You've met people like this, right? That are just complete stones and they're impervious. They might seem nice on the outside, but they are completely hard-hearted and they don't feel anything and they don't feel love or anything. And they're just they're like human stones. Like everything bounces off them. You can't communicate with them. You can't connect with them. They are like impervious, as he said. Everyone's met somebody like this, unless you are like this, and then then you're having. Another form of worship commonly thought to be advanced is to sing or recite in chorus lines in praise of the gods and goddesses they worship. People assemble in the parties at the late hours in the night, singing the chorus at the top of their voice, disturbing the calm atmosphere of the night. They think they are by discharging a pious duty or injecting, as they say, into the ears of so many as they can, the sacred name of God. Not only this, they sometimes make use of a microphone or broadcast the sound that are totally unmindful of discomfort or inconvenience it might cause to a person who may possibly be in need of quiet repose. And their day's tiring labor, illness, in quiet repose after their day's tiring labor or illness. It may at the same. So people are blaring this shit on microphones in the middle of the night, which I'll talk about when I'm done reading this section. But it's fucking annoying as hell, and people are trying to sleep, right? And these people are thinking they're connected to God, and they're whatever they're doing is when people hear it, it helps them be connected to God, but it keeps you from sleeping because it's loud as fuck, right? It may at the same time be offering serious disturbance to those who practice meditation in the calm hours of the night. Moreover, the practices generally followed today is of no great utility in our spiritual progress, and consequently no substantial gain is derived therein. The chantings of many Sanskritians, people who know Sanskrit, may be compared more appropriately to the groans of a sick man, which only offer him a temporary consolation, but do not particularly relieve him of the pain. So these chantings are of no avail to them, except they are charmed by the effect of the sweet melody, which helps to draw their thoughts for the time being to the ideal in the view. No matter whatever we think or contemplate, produces vibrations within. Now, whatever we think or contemplate produces vibrations within. I'll start back there in a second. And so in India, they have these temples. They think that they can blare their music in the middle of the night, will thus attract people. And so at the ashram in Chennai, there was 4 or 5 temples within the area that were blaring with very low quality speakers. This singing, and I don't like the singing. This kind of, I mean, you don't understand it. It sounds like gibberish. I mean, to me it did. I don't love the Indian singing. This was poor quality, and it's in all hours of the night. And I had no idea when I read this the first time what he was talking about. But I'm there in India my first time, and I'm just going through it. I'm going through a cleaning. I'm irritable. I'm very American. The Europeans, like, you hang out with mostly people like, from Europe or America, these things. You just are grouped together. And I'm sitting there with these Danish women, this older Danish woman, this nice Danish girl. Her parents were Abhyasis, and she was just like a nice spiritual person. And there's this woman, I ended up arguing with her 20 years later. And I'm like, oh my God, this is horrible, right? This moaning and this speakers, and it's just poor quality. And the ashram is very peaceful, and there's the sounds of India that blend together. The horns are often very pleasant, in terms of, but they're beeping all the time because of their lack of traffic rules and fucking lights and things. And there's nice sounds there, and there's all these cool birds, and the crows really have a cool call. Which you can hear in like these tropical places. The crows have a different way of speaking, different way of communicating in these parts of the eastern part of the world. And just all these other birds and sounds, right? And they're just blaring this shit over poor quality speakers. And I'm like, I'm like, complaining about it. And this woman goes, well, this is good for them. And she starts getting into me about fucking, they didn't like me because I was American, this kind of stuff, right? And I'm like, Babaji talks about this in the first chapter of Reality at Dawn, which I had read like 4 times by then. And I was like, do you read that chapter? Like, he says there's no benefit to this thing. And it just bugs people, which it is. It's bugging me, right? And like, and it wasn't like it was irritating. And I was in it, when you're in an irritated cleaning type stage, it's worse. But I could see where it's just fucking bullshit, right? And we got into it, and, and I didn't care. I just like was already irritated, so I didn't mind fucking, saying things to irritate. And this nice girl goes, please stop. And so I said, all right, well, I don't want to fucking wreck your time here. So I didn't pursue it. And I wasn't going to win the argument. Like, there's no winning, because this one was just obnoxious like I was. But anyways, like, this is a real thing. And so here, where did I leave off? Whatever we think or contemplate, whatever we think or contemplate produces vibrations within. When these vibrations multiply, they create power which gushes out with a sound. The vibrations carry with them the effect of thoughts and feelings of individuals, so the pious effects of the purest minds in the company is likely to be spoiled by the evil effect of the impious minds. So this is, if you are with other people, and you're spiritual and you have spiritual thoughts, but you're with people who have negative, unspiritual thoughts, there's vibrations coming from them and from you. They'll feel good because you're, providing for them some sense of peace and good feelings, and they're going to bring you down because they have shitty vibrations coming from them. So the pious effects of the pure minds in the company is likely to be spoiled by the evil effects of impious minds. The undesirable element must therefore be kept away, and its full advantage is derived from these performances. Such was the practice followed by this guy Chantayana Mahaprabhu, who held Sanskritians congregational chants with a party consisting only of those thoroughly known to him for the goodness and piety. The performance was therefore conducted behind closed doors, and no outsiders were allowed in. Sanskritian congregational chant, in fact, does not offer means of preliminary advancement, but is rather helpful only to the extent after sufficient advancement. It is the most effective only when conducted in a congenial atmosphere, overflowing with pious thought. It may also serve as a recreative change after serious mental practices. Moreover, unfortunately today, the idea too kept into view during these practices is not the highest, In most cases, they only remain along in a close touch with the idea of gods in the physical form, keeping in view their gross body and activities. The effect of this gross conception is nothing but internal grossness and opacity, which they inhale all along during the practice. A gross conception will necessarily keep you within bounds and limitations. A final approach to the absolute freedom can never be possible. This is the only reason why, in spite of years of practice, they find themselves at the lowest level of attainment. They are, to say, searching everything in a stagnant pool where even oxygen necessarily for their upkeeping of life is wanting. They also made this pool their permanent abode. Proper light is needed to make pearls. When we must strive for order to secure absolute freedom from the bondage to become the lightest and the finest, closely corresponding with the godly attributes and securing complete similarity with Him. The nectar of real life is for Him and Him alone, who brings Himself up to the standard required for this purpose. That's kind of, a lot of that's probably hard to understand for people. When I first read this book, it took me multiple times because I just, the thing with the temples, I had experience with Indian culture, and, there's so much more knowledge there and spirituality and so many different levels, like he's talking about here, right? There's the idol worship, but then there's there's chanting, there's people chant Om, there's people who do these Sanskritian choruses, and all these things have a positive effect, a vibrational effect. But then, that becomes too gross at some points, and there's something more subtle. And then if you're on your path, you start these things and you practice them one by one until you're ready for God in the absolute form of nothingness, right? So that's the end of the chapter of religion. Okay, so a kind of weird thing happened. I've read these books multiple times. The first two books I read were the complete works of Ramchandra, which include the book I just read from, the chapter of religion from Reality at Dawn. And I've read Reality at Dawn separately. I had that book separately, so I've read that more than the other 5 books. And the other book was My Master, written by Charji about Babaji. And, I was swore that the idea of fear and temptation were in Reality at Dawn, but they were in My Master. And like I said, I've read the books multiple times, and somehow I conflated those two things. So it's interesting to me, not probably so much to other people. But anyways, here it is. This is, my take on the one true religion, because, there is none. And this is, all the information I have on that subject. Only spirituality will save this world. It's Paramano, definitely pointing for the Apocalaughs. And the Ascension, everyone have a blessed day and be grateful.